Imagine a Europe not defined by nations, but by walls of ice stretching across the land, where the air is so cold that every breath turns to frost. Only a handful of humans cling to survival, on the brink of total disappearance. During what scientists call the last glacial maximum, more than 90% of Europe's population disappeared. To understand how this happened and who came after, we must first look at the people who lived in Europe before the last glacial maximum. Around 45,000 years ago, the first modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived in Europe. They gradually replaced the last Neanderthals. They brought advanced tools, crafted jewelry from animal teeth and ivory, and left behind the first examples of figurative art on cave walls. Their way of life is known today as the Aurignacian culture, the first great cultural wave of Homo sapiens in Europe. As time passed, the Aurignacian tradition began to evolve, eventually giving rise to one of the most widespread prehistoric cultures in Europe, known as the Gravettian. They hunted large animals like mammoths, built tents from bones and hides, crafted woven nets to trap small animals, and developed signature stone blades with blunt backs. They created countless Venus figurines, depictions of female bodies with wide hips and heavy breasts, but rarely with faces or limbs. They buried their dead with care and symbolism, often with beads and ornaments. Their lineage stretched back to the first modern humans who entered Europe, and throughout the early Upper Paleolithic, their genetic line remained largely intact across regions of France to Ukraine. Yet that lineage came to an abrupt end. The people who once lived from France to Ukraine between 40,000 and 23,000 years ago left no genetic trace in modern Europeans. But how? Between 26,500 and 19,000 years ago, during the coldest phase of the Ice Age, much of Europe became uninhabitable. Glaciers covered vast stretches of the north, temperatures plunged by tens of degrees, and huge regions became uninhabitable. But not all places were like this. In the far southwest of Europe, a group known as the Solutreans managed to survive. They became known for their unique leaf-shaped stone tools, created with an advanced technique called bifacial pressure flaking, a method that allowed them to shape razor-sharp points from flint with remarkable precision. When the Solutreans disappeared around 19,000 years ago, their legacy didn't vanish completely. From the same southwestern regions of Europe, a new culture began to take shape, the Magdalenians. Over time, these people expanded northward and eastward, reaching across what is now France, Spain, and into parts of Germany. They made their homes in caves, along rivers, and at the edges of retreating glaciers. On the stone walls around them, they painted scenes of bison, horses, mammoths, and deer. Their paintings help us understand how people saw and related to animals at the time. In 2023, researchers published a remarkable study analyzing DNA from Solutrean and Magdalenian fossils. They found that traces of Gravettian ancestry still persisted in every individual examined. But even those last remnants would eventually vanish, swept away by a new wave of people moving in from the east. Southeastern Europe saw the rise of a new cultural tradition, the Epigravettian, emerging in places such as Italy, the Balkans, and parts of Ukraine. The term was first introduced by Italian archaeologists to describe the final phase of the Gravettian. Over time, it came to represent a wider range of societies that lived in southern and eastern Europe after the Gravettians vanished. The Epigravettian people used simpler, more functional tools. They moved in small mobile groups hunting reindeer, horse, and ibex. Their camps were often in sheltered valleys or coastal zones near water and migratory animal routes. Unlike their predecessors, they left behind very little art or symbolic objects, perhaps because survival left little room for decoration. For centuries, it was assumed that the Epigravettians were simply the continuation of the Gravettians. Same people, same culture, just hardened to colder times. That assumption seemed natural, until in 2016, a genetic study led by Xiaomei Fu revealed something unexpected. When researchers studied the DNA of an Epigravettian individual from Italy, they found no link to the earlier Gravettians. As more DNA was analyzed, a clear pattern emerged. The Epigravettian people were not the descendants of the Gravettians. They looked similar in culture, but genetically, they came from a different lineage. These people belong to what geneticists call the Villebruno cluster, a genetic line that surprisingly shows stronger affinity with populations from the Middle East and the Southern Caucasus than with pre-Ice Age Europeans. They lived in Europe alongside the Magdalenians, but that didn't last. Around 14,700 years ago, the climate shifted again. As the ice retreated and new lands opened up, groups from the Southern Alps carrying Villebruno ancestry began moving north. Within a few thousand years, they had spread across the continent, from the Southern Alps to the Atlantic coast. In Western Europe, where remnants of Magdalenian ancestry had once survived, almost nothing of it remained. The genetic signature of the Gravettians, once dominant across much of the continent, had been completely wiped out, replaced by people whose roots traced back to the Near East. These people are known today as the Western hunter-gatherers. From around 14,000 to 8,000 years ago, they dominated most of Western and Central Europe. Their societies were small and mobile, living in forests, river valleys, and open plains. They relied heavily on hunting red deer, boar, and aurochs, and also gathering plant foods and fishing where possible. But while the WHG shaped much of Europe, further northeast, things were taking a different turn. There, Western hunter-gatherers came into contact with groups whose roots stretched back to Siberia.